40 years, began to, at least on paper, to implement its central theme of its policy in the area where there is no doubt that it has always implemented it, remember, as distinct from the Middle East. By committing those two crimes, Suharto followed a very classic path. Another recent example is Mobutu, Saddam Hussein, Duvalier, Marcos, Somoza, Trujillo. It's kind of a long list. Same two crimes are the ones that matter. You stop following orders, you lose control, you're out. And we're in favor of a democratic transition. This happens routinely, regularly, but it doesn't teach anything. You don't learn anything about policy from that because the nature of policy is a theological dogma, and therefore no evidence tells you anything. Well, let's look a little more closely at 1958. I still promise to get back to the theme if you're willing to hold out. It's very revealing. In 1958, the National Security Council, main planning body, had then secret meetings, now publicized, in which John Foster Dulles, Secretary of State, described the crises on the world scene. He said there's three major crises in the world scene in 1958. One was Indonesia, the second was Algeria, the third was the Middle East. Notice that they're all Muslim countries, but there was no clash of civilizations at that point. Those of you who are respectable intellectuals will know that now we have to soberly debate the clash of civilizations because the Cold War pretext for intervention has collapsed and we need what's called a new paradigm. But then we still had that pretext, so we didn't need a new paradigm. So the three major crises were Indonesia, Algeria, and the Middle East. In fact, they were Muslims irrelevant, but something isn't irrelevant, namely they all had oil. In fact, they were all oil centers. And in fact, the effort to cut off the outer islands was related to the concern, U.S. concerns over Middle East oil. There were some concerns that it was getting out of control and they needed some temporary supplements. Temporary because Indonesia is nowhere near the scale of the Middle East, but significant. Well, you look back at what happened and bear in mind that the United States is a global power, so its policies are usually carried out consistently in many different places. And a lot of other things were happening in 1958. The subversion in Indonesia, the rebellion in Indonesia, was the largest of the clandestine operations, maybe the largest ever. But there were others. In Burma, the United States was moving to overthrow the regime, supporting a Chinese nationalist army that had partially taken refuge there and that the United States was supporting there. I won't go into the details, but that led, Burma at that time had an elected government. That led to a military coup, the installation of the current military regime in Burma, one of the most brutal in the world. It also was instrumental in making Burma the leading heroin producer in the world, a position it now holds, and a real horror story. The state of Massachusetts now has a kind of boycott. We can trace that right back to 1958, right parallel to the when we were carrying out the central themes of our foreign policy in Indonesia. Another case right next door was Cambodia. Also had a neutralist government, which the United States didn't like. The U.S. was supporting an attack on it. That attack didn't work in 1958, but it did work in 1970, the same forces overthrowing Prince Sihanouk's government. That led to the huge U.S. bombing, the Khmer Rouge, everything that followed. Need not talk about that. A third place where something was going on in 1958 was again right nearby in Laos. Laos had its first and last free election in 1958, came out the wrong way, parties to the left won. The U.S. wouldn't accept that. Military coup took place. The U.S. installed what was called a pro-Western neutralist, and he wasn't good enough, so an ultra-right general was put in. That led to a total disaster. It sort of paved the way and actually came pretty close to a world war. It ended up with the U.S. carrying out the heaviest bombing in history against a defenseless peasant society in northern Laos, and the effects of that are still with us, though you wouldn't read it You can even read it in the U.S. newspaper. There's a very good article on it in the Wall Street Journal by their veteran Asia correspondent about a year and a half ago. Unfortunately, it's the Asian edition of the Wall Street Journal. They didn't have it in the U.S. edition. But it's quite a good article. He gives an estimate of, there's unknown numbers of unexploded bomblets just littering the plain of George. Hundreds of millions of them were dropped. They are much worse than landmines. These are not aimed at property. They do nothing against a truck. They're aimed to kill people. They're murder weapons. They're little colorful things that a kid can pick up or a farmer can hit or something. They had a failure to explode rate of about 20 to 30%, according to their manufacturers, Honeywell. And crummy as technology may be, it's hard to believe that that wasn't built in. But maybe the technologists among you can assess that likelihood. Anyway, they're supposed to have a 20 to 30% failure to explode rate, which means they're around all the time as anti-personnel weapons. And they're still there, huge numbers of them. There is the estimated, according to the Wall Street Journal report, the casualties may range up to 20,000 a year, of which more than half are deaths. Other numbers are less, but since nobody's counting, nobody really knows. But numbers of that kind are considered not unreasonable by the Wall Street Journal in its Asia edition. There is a mine clearing group, British-based mine advisory group, civilian, but based ultimately in the British Army, and other countries have come in. As the British press reports, the United States is conspicuous by its absence in the mine clearing operation. And furthermore, the right-wing British press is bitterly complaining over the fact that the United States, the Pentagon, refuses to provide what are called render harmless procedures, procedures that would defuse the mine so they wouldn't kill the people who are trying to clear them. That's a military secret, and in fact the whole thing is a secret in the United States. You have to work pretty hard to find out anything about it. That's a fact, so that's Laos. Another case in 1958 was Vietnam. I won't even talk about that. In each case, including all of these, including Indonesia, the U.S. interventions, which were significant, led to hideous atrocities, and in fact destroyed the basis of democracy, and in fact were to a large extent driven by that purpose, as in several of the cases I've mentioned. However, that doesn't influence the dogma. It's still correct. There is still no doubt that in the Middle East only the United States doesn't live up to its high ideals, but does in these places. Well, if you take a little more closer look at 1958, I won't go into this, and bring it up later if you like, but the other major case was in fact Iraq. Iraq was pulling out, had a nationalist revolution. It was pulling out of the U.S. Anglo-American condominium over oil. That was going on right in 1958 and was a major phenomenon. You look at the documentary record then, you get a pretty good explanation of everything that's going out until today. Okay, let me drop that. One of the things that's going on today, which is quite striking and leads me to the topic, finally, is a kind of a minor aspect of the bombing last December, the U.S.-UK bombing. One interesting aspect of it was that it is in blatant and flat violation of the UN Charter and international law. International law, that's one of the three pillars of world order. The basic principle of the UN Charter is that the threat or use of force in international affairs is banned except under highly restricted circumstances which don't apply, or if specifically authorized by the Security Council. Otherwise banned, threat or use of force. There's no serious doubt that the US and UK just flatly ignored that. They didn't try to get US Security Council authorization for the simple reason they knew they'd never get it. So therefore they just bombed. Now in the United States there is essentially no discussion of this. I've done a fairly extensive review. And where it's discussed, as it occasionally is, it's considered a kind of a technicality. The reason being, if a reason is ever given, that we cannot allow others to veto our policy decisions as required by the UN Charter and international law. But we alone cannot, others must stand by that, but we can't. that is unchallenged as far as I can discover. Try to find some interesting exercise. Try to find some challenge to that doctrine. I haven't found it. There is some in England. There's a lot elsewhere. So, for example, in India, the Association of Jurists has a case before the World Court condemning the U.S. and Britain for war crimes. You won't read about that either. But here it's not discussed because it's taken for granted that that's correct. We cannot submit ourselves to international law or the UN Charter because we are a violent, lawless, criminal, rogue state, and that is right and just. That's what it means. And there is near universal endorsement of that principle, among educated sectors at least, which should be taken as a warning by the world, and indeed is taken as a warning by the world, which doesn't like it, but can't do much about it. We're the ones who can do something about it. The official, and we seem to, at least judging articulate sectors, educated sectors, support it, so they're not going to do anything about it. The official stand during the bombing in December was, quoted, that we prefer to act through our allies, but we'll resort to force alone if we have to. Notice that we don't even prefer to act through the United Nations, as required by international law and the Charter. We may join our allies if they're willing to, but UN is out. In fact, the timing of the bombing was presumably intended as a slap in the face to the Security Council. The bombing was timed just as the Security Council was being called to an emergency session to deal with the question of Iraq, and it hadn't been notified. And if that didn't make headlines here, people understood it elsewhere. Things like that don't happen by accident, and they were understood. Well, that's accepted across the spectrum, and it's accepted in other cases too. So take a look at the Rambouillet meetings in Kosovo. There was a debate there about just what to do. The debate was between the United States and its allies, and the NATO powers, nobody else around, and the debate was over the wording. Should the wording of the NATO decision to bomb be stated as being authorized by the United Nations or only being endorsed by the United Nations? The U.S. insisted on endorse. As the New York Times put it, it wanted to avoid the neuralgic word authorize, which would entail that international law has some significance. And the U.S. won't accept that, even at the rhetorical level. And as usual, the U.S. won, so the most they get to do is endorse, not authorize. Let alone order, which is what the law requires. And it's not just in this case, it's in every case. So take, say, the bombing of the Sudan last August. I mean, it's now conceded. You know, nobody even tries to, very few even try to deny that the U.S. just bombed a pharmaceutical plant in Sudan and destroyed half of Sudan's pharmaceutical industry. Well, you know, sometimes things go wrong. There's no talk about war crimes, no talk about reparations, not even any talk about an apology. I mean, why should we apologize if we destroy half of the pharmaceuticals in a poor East African country? You know, let's be serious. Furthermore, that's accepted across the spectrum. Okay, there's a further history for this. 10 years ago, the United States took the same stand explicitly with regard to the World Court, dared to follow a case against the United States and indeed to condemn the United States for the unlawful use of force in its war against Nicaragua. The United States position was clear and explicit. The State Department, legal department, said that we cannot accept World Court jurisdiction. They explained why. The reason is that other states do not agree with us. They do not accept their policies. And they said we must therefore reserve to ourselves the right to decide when court rulings apply, and we must reject court rulings, I'm quoting now, for any dispute involving matters essentially within the domestic jurisdiction of the United States as determined by the United States. The example in question was the U.S. war against Nicaragua, and the United States determined that that was within its domestic jurisdiction, so the World Court could get lost. And that was done with virtually 100% support of educated intellectuals, including leading advocates of world order who write articles in law journals and so on and so forth. The New York Times dismissed